He signed the papers without looking at her. That was the part that broke something inside Margaret Holloway, not the lawyer's voice, reading out the terms, not the stack of documents that divided 31 years of marriage into line items and asset columns. It was the fact that Daniel never once looked up. He sat across that polished oak table, uncapped his pen, and signed her name out of his life like he was approving a purchase order. The cabin in the mountains, the one they'd built together with borrowed money and bleeding hands, went to him. Counts. The investments. The house in Asheville. Everything she'd poured herself into for 3 decades. Redistributed with the scratch of a pen. Margaret was 58 years old. She had $43 in her personal checking account and a duffel bag in the trunk of a car she'd have to return by Friday. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if something in these next few minutes hits you somewhere deep, leave a like. It means more than you know now. Let's go back to where it all began. The morning Margaret Holloway walked out of Caldwell and Morris Family Law, the sky was doing that particular thing it does in late October in western North Carolina, gray, pressing down on gray, the mountains swallowed whole by clouds, so low you'd think the world had a ceiling. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a long moment, her duffel bag at her feet, her coat buttoned wrong. She didn't notice the button thing until she was already 2 blocks away. She fixed it, standing in front of a hardware store window, staring at her own reflection without really seeing it. The woman looking back at her had good cheekbones and bad posture and hair that had gone silver at the temples, sometime around her 54th birthday, which Daniel had spent in Denver at a conference that she now understood had not actually been a conference. Her phone buzzed. Her daughter, Carrie. She let it go to voicemail. She'd been letting things go to voicemail for a while now. It was easier than talking, easier than having to manage other people's feelings about her situation when she could barely locate her own. Carrie would say all the right things in the wrong tone, that particular mix of love and exhaustion that Margaret had heard in her daughter's voice ever since the night 6 months ago when Margaret had called her at 11:30 p.m. and said very quietly, "Your father has been seeing someone." For 4 years, there had been a long silence on the line. Then Carrie had said, "Mom, come stay with us." And Margaret had said, "I'll be fine." She had not been fine. She walked to her car, a 2019 Subaru Outback that was technically still in her name, for the next 72 hours until the settlement finalized and Daniel's attorney reclaimed it as part of the marital asset division, and she sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The duffel bag was in the back seat now. It contained 3 changes of clothes, her toiletries, a paperback she'd been trying to finish since July, her laptop, and a folder of documents that represented the sum total of what she was walking away with. $43. Well, $43 and 11 months of alimony payments that Daniel's attorney had negotiated down from her original ask with such efficiency, it had felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a mugging. After the 11 months, nothing. Her attorney, the one she'd had to let go after the 3rd month because she couldn't sustain, the retainer had told her that 11 months was actually better than most people got, given the circumstances. Given that Margaret hadn't worked in 22 years. She'd left her job in 2002 to raise Carrie and their son, Ben. Daniel had said it made more sense. He was the one with the growing income, the career trajectory, the potential. Margaret had a marketing degree from UNC Asheville and 3 years of experience at a mid-size regional ad firm that no longer existed. She'd agreed with him because at 36, with a newborn and a 4-year-old, it had seemed like the obvious, practical, loving thing to do. She wonders sometimes when exactly a practical decision becomes a trap. Whether there's a single moment you can point to, a door you could have not walked through, or whether it happens the way erosion happens, so slowly you don't notice until the ground gives out under you. The engine ticked in the cold. She started the car. She had 2 options in front of her. She could drive to Carrie's house in Raleigh, which was 4 hours east, where she would sleep in the guest room that smelled like lavender candles and accept meals cooked with loving pity and watch her daughter and son-in-law exchange careful looks across the dinner table. Carrie would be wonderful. Carrie would be more wonderful than Margaret could stand right now. Or she could go north on 26 and then cut west on the old logging road past Walden Creek and drive up into the Pisgah until the road ran out. She sat at the light on Marymount Avenue for 45 seconds. Then she went north. She hadn't eaten since the previous night half a granola bar she'd found in her coat pocket, which was not a meal, but which she'd treated with the desperate reverence of someone who has run out of options. The settlement had been scheduled for 9 a.m., and she'd been too nauseous to eat before it. Now it was just past 11, and her blood sugar was doing something she could feel in her hands. She stopped at a gas station outside Weaverville, bought a coffee and a package of peanut butter crackers and a bottle of water. The girl at the register, maybe 20, wearing a hoodie with a small rip at the collar, didn't look up from her phone while she scanned the items. "That's $4.17, the girl said. Margaret paid with cash from her wallet. She had $38 and some change left now. She was aware this was not a sustainable situation. She was aware that she needed a plan, a real one that involved employment and housing and all the adult infrastructure she hadn't had to think about in over 2 decades. She was aware of all of this, the way you're aware of a very large, very complicated problem that your brain has simply decided to table for the time being in the interest of basic functioning. She ate the crackers in the parking lot, drank half the coffee, watched a man in a yellow jacket wrestle a cart full of lumber into the back of a pickup truck. He dropped a 2x4 on his foot and said something she couldn't hear through the windshield, but his face said it all. She almost smiled. Then she pulled out of the parking lot and kept driving. The logging road past Walden Creek was officially closed to non-forestry vehicles between November and March, which Margaret knew because she'd driven it 100 times before with Daniel. Back in the years when they used to go up into the mountains together. Back when they were the kind of couple that did things together. The gate was padlocked, but the chain had been jury-rigged. For years, you had to lift the right side of the gate and angle it, and there was just enough give to squeeze a car through. Daniel had shown her that trick in 1997, 27 years ago. That detail hit her, somewhere between her sternum and her throat. She squeezed the Subaru through. The road up was rough in a way that the Subaru handled badly, the undercarriage scraping twice on exposed rock faces, the tires spinning loose on a patch of wet clay before catching. Margaret drove with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, leaning forward like that would help, which it wouldn't. The trees closed in on either side, hemlock and yellow birch, and the occasional red spruce, all of them bare-limbed now except for the hemlocks, which stayed stubbornly green no matter what the season did to them. She'd loved that about hemlocks once. She'd told Daniel about it once on one of these drives, and he'd said, and changed the subject, and she'd told herself that was fine, that people had different interests, that a marriage didn't require you to care about the same things. She was 58 years old, and she had just signed away 31 years of her life, and she was driving up an illegal road into a closed national forest with $38 to her name. The road ended at a small clearing that the Forestry Service used for equipment, staging a flat gravel pad, maybe 60 feet square, ringed by the tree line on 3 sides. There was a rusting metal shed at the far edge, and beyond it, through a gap in the trees, you could see the ridge line. In good weather, from this clearing, you could see 3 counties, and the blue dark suggestion of Tennessee in the far distance. Today there was only cloud. She parked and got out and stood there in the cold, and the wind came off the ridge and cut through her coat, and she thought, what exactly am I doing? She didn't have an answer. She opened the trunk, pulled out the duffel, and sat on a rusted equipment rail at the edge of the clearing. The peanut butter crackers had taken the edge off her blood sugar. The coffee was cooling in her hand. She could hear the wind in the trees, and somewhere below the ridge, the sound of water moving fast over rock. She sat there for a long time. At some point she started talking. Not to anyone, just out loud, because the silence was getting to be too much, and there was nobody to hear her either way. Okay, she said. So, she looked at her hands. She'd gotten her nails done 2 weeks ago, a standing appointment she'd had for years, biweekly, at a place north Asheville that Daniel paid for through the joint account. The polish was starting to chip at the edges now, a pale blush color she'd picked, because it was inoffensive and blended with everything, which she was now realizing was a kind of metaphor that she didn't have the emotional bandwidth to unpack right this moment. "You are 58 years old," she told her hands. "You have a marketing degree. You haven't worked in 22 years. You have $38. She paused. "And a car you have to give back Thursday." She paused again. That's really she started, and then she laughed. It came out strange, a little wild, the kind of laugh that lives right on the border with something else entirely. It echoed in the clearing, and the hemlocks absorbed it, and she clapped a hand over her mouth and held the laugh in until it turned into something quieter, and she pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes. She was not going to do this here. She was not going to fall apart in a gravel staging area in a closed national forest in the middle of a weekday morning. She lowered her hands. Up on the ridge, something moved through the trees. She watched the tree line for a moment, probably a deer, probably nothing. But it made her look up, and when she looked up, she saw, through the gap in the hemlocks at the far edge of the clearing, something she hadn't noticed when she arrived. Not the ridge, not the cloud, a structure, old maybe. The suggestion of 4 walls, or what had been 4 walls at some point in the past. Stones, she thought. A chimney stack, still standing though the thing it had been connected to was reduced to its foundation, and a scatter of timber. It was maybe 200 yards from the clearing, up a rise through the hemlock stand. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at the car. Then she looked back at the stones. She picked up her duffel, finished the cold coffee in one long swallow, and walked toward the trees. The rise was steeper than it looked from the clearing, and she was in no shape for it. She hadn't been hiking in years. And the dress boots she was wearing, perfectly reasonable for a legal proceeding, but not remotely suited to this terrain, started giving her trouble immediately. She turned her ankle twice on hidden rocks, under the leaf litter, caught herself on a hemlock branch, kept going. The structure, when she reached it, was not what she'd thought from below. It was older than she'd estimated. The chimney stack was fieldstone and old mortar, and the mortar was cracked through in places. But the stack itself was sound, 12, maybe 14 feet tall. The foundation walls were still largely intact, 4 courses of the same fieldstone, enclosing a rectangle roughly 20 by 24 feet. The timber that had once been the floors and walls and roof had rotted down to debris, but the bones of it were there. She stood inside the foundation, standing on cold ground and leaf mold and the skeletal remnants of something that had once been someone's structure, and she looked at the chimney and the walls and the view, because from up here, even in the cloud, you could see the whole valley below, could see Walden Creek as a dark line between the ridges, could see the smoke from someone's chimney far below, small and domestic and impossibly far away. Her phone buzzed. Carrie again. She looked at the screen. Then she opened the camera and took a picture of the chimney. Wide shot, the fieldstone against the gray sky, the view behind it. She didn't know why she did that. She stood there for another 20 minutes, not thinking about anything particular, just breathing the cold air and looking at the stones. At some point, the clouds shifted, and a piece of late morning light came through just a crack of it, there and gone, and hit the valley below and lit it up briefly, all gold and amber and the dark blue-green of the hemlocks, and it was so startling and so unwanted in its beauty that she had to look away. She went back down to the car. She drove back down the logging road more carefully than she'd come up. At the gate, she stopped and resecured the chain the way Daniel had showed her, out of habit, out of some stubborn muscle memory that apparently survived divorce proceedings. She sat at the bottom of the logging road for 4 minutes, engine running. Then she called Carrie back. "Mom," Carrie said immediately. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm okay," Margaret said. "I'm outside Weaverville. I went for a drive." "You went for a drive? To the settlement?" "Yes." A pause. "Do you want to come to Raleigh? We have plenty of—" "Carrie," Margaret looked at her hands on the wheel. Chipped blush polish. "I need you to look something up for me." "What?" "Forest Service parcels in the Pisgah, specifically around the Walden Creek area. Anything about property boundaries, old land claims, anything on the sale or lease side." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom," Carrie said carefully. "What did you do?" "Nothing yet," Margaret said, "but I need you to look it up." She drove back toward Weaverville. Behind her, up in the hemlock stand, The old chimney stack stood in the cloud exactly as it had for what she'd later learn was 89 years. Nobody had touched it in a long time. Nobody had even looked at it in a long time, until today. And in the parking lot of a Weaverville gas station, on a cold Tuesday in October, with $38 and a borrowed car, and a life that had just been legally redivided along lines she hadn't chosen, Margaret Holloway opened her laptop, typed Pisgah National Forest, Adjacent Private Parcels Walden Creek into the search bar, and started reading. Her hands had stopped shaking. That surprised her. She'd expected them to keep shaking for a while yet, but they'd stopped. The search results came back in layers, the way searches always do the useful, buried under the useless, the relevant hiding 3 pages deep behind real estate aggregators and tourism blogs, and one very enthusiastic hiking forum where someone had posted about a waterfall near Walden Creek in 2019 and received 11 replies, none of which were relevant to Margaret's situation. She sat in the Weaverville gas station parking lot with the engine running for heat, the laptop balanced on the steering wheel, and she read everything she could find about land ownership in the Pisgah National Forest adjacent zone. What she found was this: the Forest Service owned the land on the ridge, but the parcel directly below the ridgeline, the slope where the hemlock stand grew, where the old chimstack rose out of the leaf mold, and the crumbling foundation, sat like a half-remembered sentence. That parcel was different. It was a private in holding, one of those strange pockets of non-federal land that had gotten folded into the national forest boundary without ever actually becoming federal property. Someone had owned it once. Someone had built something on it. And then, for reasons that weren't clear from the county tax records, she managed to pull up on a Buncombe County assessor's website that looked like it had last been updated in 2009. The taxes had stopped being paid somewhere around 2017. 7 years of delinquent taxes on a 4.2-acre mountain parcel. Her coffee was cold. She didn't notice. She called Carrie back. "Okay," Carrie said before Margaret could speak. "I looked it up. You're talking about a tax lien parcel situation. You looked it up already? You called me and asked me to look up forest land claims and then hung up to drive somewhere." "Yes, I looked it up already." A brief pause. "Are you in trouble?" "I'm not in trouble, because if Daniel did something, if there's something the attorney missed." "This isn't about Daniel," Margaret said, and the cleanness of saying that surprised her. She said it again more quietly. "This isn't about him. There's a piece of land up there. Old structure on it. 4.2 acres. 7 years of back taxes." Silence on Carrie's end. The kind of silence that meant her daughter was doing math she didn't like. "Mom, how much back taxes?" Margaret had the county assessor page pulled up on the screen. She read the numbers out. Another silence. This one had a different texture. That's not nothing," Carrie said slowly. "But it's manageable," Margaret said. "It's potentially manageable." "What money?" Carrie's voice was careful, the way it got when she was trying not to say the thing she was actually thinking. "Mom, you have $43, $38 now. This is not better." "I know the number," Margaret said. "I know what I have. I'm not delusional, Carrie. I just need to understand the process. For a tax lien acquisition, walk me through what you found." There was a long pause. She could hear her daughter breathing, could hear the faint background noise of Carrie's kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of her son, 5-year-old Oliver, doing something in the next room. "You'd have to go through the county," Carrie said finally. "Delinquent parcels go to public auction in North Carolina. You'd bid against other people. And Mom, real estate investors watch these listings. People who do this for a living. You wouldn't just be, 'When's the next auction?' I'd have to look." "Can you look? While we're on the phone? Please." She heard Carrie set the phone down, heard a keyboard, heard Oliver say something about a dinosaur, and Carrie respond with the automatic warmth of a mother on a task. It occurred to Margaret that she used to do that, conduct adult business with half her brain, while the other half fielded the endless, small emergencies of small children. And she had done it for years without thinking of it as a skill, the way you don't think of breathing as a skill until something interrupts it. "March," Carrie said, picking the phone back up. "There's a county tax sale scheduled for March 14th. The Walden Creek parcel is listed." March. That was 4.5 months away. Margaret looked at the parking lot, at the man in the yellow jacket, who was now sitting in his truck eating something, At the gas station, signs cycling through prices. What do I need to do to register to bid? Mom, Carrie, what do I need to do? The sigh her daughter released was long and deeply familiar. The same sigh Carrie had been producing since age 14 when Margaret made decisions she disagreed with, which was, historically, more often than either of them would have liked to admit. You need a government-issued ID, proof of funds, or a cashier's check for 10% of your bid at time of auction, and registration with the county no later than 5 business days before the sale. Carrie read this in a flat voice that made it clear she was reading it directly and not endorsing any of it. And Mom, the minimum bid starts at the tax liability plus fees. That's not a small number. I know, I'm saying you can't go up there with $38 and claim a mountain. I know that. Then what are you? I'm making a plan, Margaret said. That's what I'm doing. I'm making a plan. She closed the laptop. The man in the yellow jacket had finished eating and was looking at his phone. The gas station sign said regular was $4.11 a gallon. 4 months and 13 days to March 14th. She had 11 months of alimony coming the first payment. Daniel's attorney had specified would be deposited within 30 days of the settlement finalization. She did the math in her head, not carefully, not precisely, but roughly. 11 months. If she was very careful about where she spent it, if she kept her living costs low enough, if she could find some kind of work in the meantime. It wasn't enough. The math didn't work. Not clean, not the way she'd need it to. But it was something. It was more than nothing. She put the car in drive. Carrie's voice still coming from the phone in the cup holder. Mom, where are you going? To find somewhere cheap to sleep, Margaret said. Do you know if the Ridgecrest Motel on 26 is still open? I have no idea if, Mom, you should come to Raleigh. You don't have to, I love you, Margaret said. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up. She found the Ridgecrest Motel still open. Barely it was the kind of place that had been losing ground to the chain hotels off the interstate since the mid-90s and knew it. The exterior was clean, but the paint on the door frames was peeling, and the vending machine in the lobby had a handwritten out-of-order sign taped to it with masking tape. The woman at the front desk was maybe 70, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a crossword puzzle face down on the counter. How long? The woman said. I'm not sure yet, Margaret said. Can I book by the week? The woman looked at her, not unkindly, but with the comprehensive assessment of someone who has spent years evaluating the situations of people who check into roadside motels. Cash or card? Cash, Margaret said. Weekly's $280, the woman said. Plus tax. Includes the room, doesn't include breakfast. There's a diner 2 miles south on 26 that does eggs for $4.50 if you're looking. Margaret paid with the cash from her wallet. She had enough for the week, barely, if she didn't eat much. She needed to get to a bank and access the joint account. What remained of it? The small personal account the attorney had managed to carve out for her in the final settlement before Daniel's people closed it down entirely. The attorney had told her she had a window. She needed to move faster than she had been. Room 7 had a bed with a blue comforter and a small desk and a bathroom with adequate hot water. She checked the hot water first thing, sat on the edge of the bed with her laptop and her legal folder and her phone, and worked through it methodically, the way she'd learned to work through things when the children were small and the tasks were large and Daniel was traveling and there was nobody else to do it. She opened a separate bank account online that night, transferred what she was entitled to from the joint account before the window closed. It took 4 attempts because her password had been changed, and she had to call the bank's customer service line and spend 37 minutes on hold before speaking to someone who could verify her identity and reset her access. 37 minutes. She used the time to read 3 different North Carolina tax lien law summaries on her phone and take notes on the back of an envelope she found in her coat pocket. The account balance, when she finally got in, was less than she'd expected. Not dramatically less. But Daniel had moved more than she'd realized before the settlement locked things down. Her attorney had warned her this sometimes happened. She'd said she understood. She hadn't fully understood until she saw the number on the screen. She sat with that for a moment. Then she transferred what she was entitled to into her new account, confirmed the transfer, and closed the laptop. She lay on top of the blue comforter in her clothes and looked at the ceiling. 4 months and 13 days. She needed a job. She hadn't held a job in 22 years, which was a sentence that didn't get less strange no matter how many times she turned it over. She had a degree. She had skills that had atrophied in some ways and sharpened in others. She'd managed household finances, managed contractors, managed a family's complex logistics, managed what amounted to a small nonprofit when she'd volunteered as coordinator for the school's arts program for 6 years. She was organized and she was capable, and she was 58 years old in a job market that, from everything she'd read, was not particularly interested in 58-year-old women re-entering the workforce after 2 decades. She knew this. She'd read the statistics. She was aware. She was also, at this particular moment, lying on a motel bed in Weaverville, North Carolina, with the remains of a peanut butter cracker purchase as her last meal, and so the statistics could wait. In the morning, she drove to Asheville. She'd avoided Asheville since Daniel had moved back into the house. Their house, his house now, after she'd left in May. The city had too much of them in it, too many restaurants they'd gone to together, too many streets, connected too many streets with some memories she wasn't ready to touch. But she needed the city. She needed the library, which had faster internet than the motel. She needed the grocery store. She needed the secondhand shop on Lexington where she could sell 3 pieces of jewelry that she'd worn twice and wouldn't miss. The jewelry got her $90. The woman at the shop was apologetic about the amount, explaining about the current gold rate, and Margaret said it was fine. It was genuinely fine. She needed the money more than the jewelry. She sat in the library for 4 hours, made a list. Real, specific, actionable, not the kind of list she used to make when she had time and resources and was planning a vacation or a renovation, the kind where half the items were aspirational. This list was just what has to happen and in what order. Item 1 was a job. Any job that would take her close to where she was, that paid enough to keep her in the motel room while she saved. She skills in organization and communication and project management, even if her resume didn't reflect them in the terms that mattered to HR departments. She needed to translate what she'd actually done for 22 years into language that would survive as a screening algorithm. She spent 2 hours on that translation alone. She applied for 4 positions that afternoon. Administrative coordinator at a medical practice in Weaverville, office manager for a small construction company in Mars Hill, part-time bookkeeping at a local accounting firm. And because it was there and the pay was listed and she needed to be realistic about her options, front desk associate at a lodge outside Barnardsville that served the hiking crowd, available immediately, no degree required. She sent the applications, closed her laptop, and drove back to the motel. The accounting firm called her the next morning. A man named Phil Garrett, who had a voice like he'd been living in the mountains his whole life and spoke in sentences that contained no wasted words. He asked her 3 questions. Could she use QuickBooks? Could she start next Monday? And was she comfortable with tax season workloads? She could not use QuickBooks. She told him this directly. He was quiet for a moment. You willing to learn it before Monday? Yes, she said. It's Thursday, I'm aware. Another brief silence. She could hear something in the background, maybe a radio, something country and low. Come in Friday morning, he said. 9 o'clock, I'll show you the system. She spent Thursday learning QuickBooks from YouTube tutorials on her phone in the motel room, taking notes. In a spiral notebook she'd bought at the gas station, pausing and rewinding and replaying segments until she understood not just the steps but the logic underneath them. She went through half a notebook. Her hand was cramping by 10p. She learned it. Not perfectly, there were modules she hadn't touched, functions she'd only skimmed. But the core of it, the structure, the way the accounts connected to each other, the logic of the reconciliation process, she had that. Phil Garrett's accounting office was 3 rooms above a hardware store on the main street of a small town called Ivy Ridge, 9 miles east of Weaverville. The stairs were steep and the office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been brewing since early morning. Phil himself was 64, which she didn't know until later, and looked older, with reading glasses that he took on and off compulsively during conversation and a desk that was functionally a geological formation of paperwork. He showed her the system. She asked good questions, he noticed. You said you've been out of the workforce, he said. Not accusatory, just factual, partway through the morning. 22 years, she said. He looked at her over the reading glasses. What were you doing? She considered how to answer that. Managing things, she said finally. A household, finances, kids, contractors, a volunteer coordination role for about 6 years. Budgets, scheduling, communications. Nothing that would show up on a resume in a way that means anything to most people. Phil looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the geological formation on his desk. Can you file? He said. She looked at the desk. By subject, date, or client? All three. Yes, he hired her. Not generously, the pay was modest. The hours were part-time until tax season when they'd expand. But it was work, it was income, and it was starting Monday. She walked out of Phil Garrett's office at noon on a Friday and stood on the main street of Ivy Ridge and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. She had done a thing, not a thing done for her, not a thing arranged by someone else. Thing she had done. It wasn't the kind of victory that you called someone about. It was too small for that, too fragile. She just stood there on the sidewalk in the cold November air and let herself have it for 30 seconds. Then she walked to the gas station 2 blocks down and bought a sandwich and ate it in the car. She called Carrie that evening. I got a job, she said. Carrie's pause was brief. Already? Accounting office. Part-time. It's not much, but it's something. Mom. A softness in her daughter's voice that Margaret had to brace herself for. You don't have to do this alone. You could come here and... I'm not doing it alone, Margaret said. I'm doing it myself. Those are different things. Another pause. Then quietly. Okay. I need to ask you something, Margaret said. The land thing. I'm still thinking about it. I'm going to need help with the research side. The legal process, the property history, what the structure might require. I can't pay you. I know you can't pay me, Carrie said with the first hint of something lighter. You have $38. 22 now. Mother, I ate today. I ate yesterday. I'm fine. She paused. Will you help me? Carrie was quiet for a moment. Margaret could hear Oliver in the background again, and the voice of Carrie's husband, David, saying something, and the particular domestic hum of a household that was functioning normally, that had its routines intact, that had not recently been cleaved in two by a pen scratch on an oak table. Yeah, Carrie said, of course I will. What Carrie found, over the following 2 weeks, working during Oliver's nap times, and after David went to bed, was a property history that was strange and layered, and that Carrie described, in one late-night phone call, as weirdly sad. Parcel had been homesteaded in the 1930s by a man named Earl Voss, who had built the original structure, a cabin, the county records from 1934 indicated, of sound fieldstone construction with timber frame interior up on the Hemlock slope. Earl Voss had died in 1971, and the property had passed to his son, Robert Voss, who had maintained it intermittently until 2003, when Robert had apparently moved to Florida and taken the property's active management with him. Robert had died in 2015. The property had passed through his estate to a nephew in Tennessee, a man named Gary Voss, who had paid taxes for 2 years, then stopped. Gary Voss was, as best Carrie could determine, very much alive and very much uninterested in a 4.2-acre mountain parcel in North Carolina that he had inherited and never visited. Did you contact him? Margaret asked. No. I thought you might want to. Margaret thought about that. Is there a number? I found a phone number associated with an address in Knoxville, Carrie said carefully. I want to be clear that I am not a private investigator, and I have no idea if this is current or legal for you to use. Give it to me. Mom, give me the number. She called Gary Voss on a Tuesday evening in late November, 3 weeks after the settlement, sitting in the parking lot of the Ridgecrest Motel with the engine running and her notes spread across the passenger seat. He picked up on the fourth ring. Yeah. A flat voice, cautious the way people get when unknown numbers call. Mr. Voss. My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm calling about a property in Buncombe County, North Carolina. Parcel near Walden Creek. A long pause. Long enough that she thought he might hang up. What about it? He said. I understand it's been tax delinquent since 2017, she said. I understand it's going to a county auction in March. I wanted to speak with you directly before that happened. Another pause. Something shifted in his silence, not warmer, exactly, but less defensive. What do you want? He said. I want to buy it from you, Margaret said. Before the auction, lady, Gary Voss said, nobody wants that property. My uncle couldn't give it away. I do, she said. I want it. A long exhale on his end. She could hear a television in the background, something with a laugh track. There's back taxes, he said. 7 years. You'd have to cover those too. I know. It's a ruin up there. The cabin's been gone since the 90s. Just a chimney and a foundation. It's rock and trees. There's no road access, except a Forestry Service road that you're not supposed to use. I know, she said. The silence after that was different. She could feel him recalculating her, trying to figure out what she was and what this was. What are you going to do with it? He finally asked. Build something, she said. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite dismissal. You got money for that? Not yet, she said. But I will. Another pause. She heard him shift, heard the chair or couch underneath him creak. Call me back in January, he said. I'll think about it. She sat in the parking lot after he hung up and wrote the date in her notebook. January. 6 weeks away. She'd used the 6 weeks to build the money, build the case, learn everything she needed to know. She looked at the chimney photo on her phone. She'd looked at it so many times by now that she'd stopped really seeing it. The way you stop seeing something once it moves from curiosity into something closer to necessity. She turned the phone face down on the seat. She had an early morning. She had a job to be good at. She had a mountain that didn't belong to her, yet, and a man in Knoxville who had said, call me back in January, and a daughter doing research during nap times, and an accounting office full of paperwork that needed organizing. She needed to sleep. She went inside. She did not sleep for a long time. What kept her awake was not fear, not exactly. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you've committed to something before you fully understand it, when the decision has been made somewhere in your body before your mind has caught up to it. She had made decisions the careful way her whole life, weighed them, discussed them, run them past Daniel, waited for his assessment before fully committing to her own. Even the decisions that had been hers in practice, the school choices, the contractors, the volunteer work had always been run through him first, calibrated against his reaction. She had called Gary Voss alone. She had made the call, had the conversation, had asked for what she wanted directly, without running it past anyone first. That was new. She wasn't sure if it was healthy or reckless or some third thing she didn't have a word for yet. She suspected it was all three simultaneously. By December, she had settled into something resembling a routine. Work at Phil's office Monday through Friday, sometimes Saturday mornings during the busy weeks. The motel room, which she'd upgraded to a monthly rate, once the first alimony payment cleared, still modest, still peeling paint on the doorframe, but hers. Dinner at the diner 2 miles south on 26, usually the soup and the side salad, occasionally the eggs if it had been a long week. Phone calls with Carrie twice a week. One call with Ben, her son, who lived in Portland and who had reacted to the divorce with a long, careful silence followed by an offer to help financially that Margaret had declined and that Ben had not pressed, which was the right call, which told her she'd raised him correctly, even if she sometimes couldn't remember the specifics of how. Phil Garrett turned out to be the kind of employer who gave feedback rarely and accurately. In her second week, he'd looked at the filing system she'd rebuilt and said, "This is better," which she later learned was, for Phil, effusive. In her fourth week, he'd asked her to sit in on a client meeting as note-taker, and she'd noticed something in the numbers the client presented that Phil had missed, a discrepancy in the quarterly figures, and she'd written it on the notepad and slid it across to him mid-meeting without interrupting, and he'd glanced at it and then looked at her over the glasses and nodded once. At the end of December, he told her he was raising her hourly rate. "Why?" she asked, which was a strange response to a raise, and she knew it. "You're worth more than I'm paying you," he said. "That's the whole reason." She called Gary Voss on January 3rd as promised. Picked up faster this time. They talked for 40 minutes. She'd spent December learning every piece of the property's history, the tax lien process, the legal chain of title, the structural requirements for the county to recognize a rebuilt structure on a private inholding in a national forest adjacent zone. She'd had 3 conversations with a real estate attorney in Asheville who gave her a free consultation and told her the situation was unconventional but not impossible. She made Gary Voss an offer. It was low. It was all she could construct with what she had and what she could demonstrate she was building toward. She explained the alimony structure. She offered to take on the full 7 years of back taxes, which would clear his name from the delinquency, in exchange for a seller finance sale at a price she'd calculated carefully. Gary Voss was quiet for a long time. "You a real estate investor?" he said. "No." "You a developer?" "No." "What are you?" She thought about it. "Someone who needs somewhere to be," she said. That answer seemed to settle something for him. She heard him breathe. "I'll need it in writing," he said. "I'll have a draft to you by Friday," she said. She had a draft to him by Wednesday. Carrie had helped her structure it. The attorney in Asheville had reviewed it for a flat fee she'd paid from the November alimony deposit. It was a purchase agreement, seller-financed, with a payment structure she could actually sustain. Gary Voss signed it on January 19th. She was in Phil's office when Carrie texted her the confirmation. She excused herself and went to the bathroom at the end of the hall and stood with both hands on the sink and looked at her face in the mirror. The nail polish was long gone. She'd stopped replacing it. She looked older than she had in October, she thought. Not in a bad way. Just differently. Like something had shifted under the surface of her face, rearranged itself into something more settled. She owned 4.2 acres of hemlock slope and a ruined foundation and a 90-year-old fieldstone chimney on a ridge in the Pisgah. She had paid nothing yet except the signed paper. The actual transfer wouldn't complete until she made the first payment in February. There was still the back taxes, still the rebuild, still every practical enormity of what she was planning. But the paper was signed. She went back to the office. Phil looked up when she came in. "Everything okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the reading glasses halfway down his nose. She could tell he knew something had happened. Phil Garrett was not an unobservant man, despite the geological desk. But he didn't ask. "There's a box of Q3 statements on the corner," he said. "Clients coming in Thursday. I'll have them sorted by end of day," she said. She sat down and she started sorting. Outside the window, the January sky over Ivy Ridge was the hard, bright blue it gets in deep winter, the kind that looks warm from inside and isn't. The mountains were clear. Today she could see the ridge line from where she sat, could see the dark line of the hemlocks against the blue, and she knew, roughly, where on that ridge her chimney was standing. Chimney. She turned back to the Q3 statements. She had work to do. The first payment to Gary Voss cleared on February 3rd, and the back taxes were filed with the county on February 9th, and Margaret Holloway became, on paper, the legal owner of 4.2 acres of mountain slope on February 22nd, which was a Wednesday, which was also the day Phil Garrett's office heat went out, and they worked in their coats all morning, and she didn't even mind because she kept thinking what's about the county recorder's stamp on the deed transfer document that Carrie had scanned and emailed to her at 7:45 that morning. She printed it at the library on her lunch break. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket and carried it there for 3 days before she realized what she was doing, which was the same thing she used to do with important things. When the children were small permission slips, vaccination records, anything she needed to keep track of and couldn't afford to lose. She'd carry them in her coat pocket until she had a safe place to put them. She didn't have a safe place yet. That was the whole point. The deed was hers. The land was hers. What sat on the land was a ruin, and what she needed to do about the ruin was the question that had been building in her since January, since she'd stopped being able to think about anything except the practical specifics of it. You couldn't just go up there with lumber and intention. You needed permits. You needed a structural plan. You needed to understand the county's requirements for a dwelling on a private and holding adjacent to national forest land, which were specific and not simple, and which involved a set of regulations she'd been reading through on her phone at night in the motel room with the kind of intensity she'd once reserved for medical research when the children were sick, which were to see she needed help she didn't know how to get yet. Phil Garrett, on a Thursday in late February, set a mug of coffee on her desk he'd fixed the heat. The office smelled like burned dust from the radiators. Coming back to life and sat in the chair across from her, which he almost never did. Phil operated in his own orbit. He didn't usually enter hers. "You're researching something," he said. She looked up. "I'm always researching something. Not like this." He glanced at the stack of printed documents beside her keyboard: building codes, Forest Service adjacency guidelines, county zoning maps. That's not accounting. She considered how much to tell him. Phil was not a man who rewarded over-explanation. I bought a piece of land, she said. He waited. Up in the Pisgah, off Walden Creek. There's a ruined structure on it. Fieldstone foundation, old chimney. I want to rebuild it. Phil looked at the stack of documents. He looked at her. You know how to build? He said. No, she said. He nodded slowly. The way he nodded when he was thinking something through before he said it. My nephew does, he said, Lyle. He's a contractor. Does residential, mostly. Does some restoration work. She looked at him. He's not cheap, Phil said. But he's honest, which in my experience is harder to find. He paused. I can give you his number. What you do with it is your business. She called Lyle Garrett that evening from the motel room. He had his uncle's directness without the silence around it. He talked more than Phil did, asked more questions, wanted the specifics up front. Private in holding in a forest adjacency zone, he repeated back to her. Okay, that's complicated, I know. What's the access situation? Forestry Service Road. Not official vehicle access. Pause. That's okay, that's a real problem. How do you get materials up? Don't know yet, she said. That's part of what I need to figure out. Can I see the site? She hesitated. Not because she didn't want him to see it, but because bringing another person to the site felt like a different kind of commitment, a step from private plan to actual construction project with other people's time and judgment involved. Yes, she said. They drove up on a Saturday in early March. Separately, she took her car, which she'd bought used in January with a portion of the February alimony payment, a 2011 Honda CR-V with 114,000 miles that the dealer in Weaverville had let her have for $4,200 and which she'd spent $106 having inspected before she bought it, which was the right call because the inspector found a brake issue that she'd gotten the dealer to fix before signing. She was learning to do due diligence on things. It was a slower, more careful way to move through the world than she'd been trained to use, and she was finding she was good at it. Lyle Garrett was 37 and looked like he spent most of his time outdoors, which he did. He drove a truck with tools in the bed and had the kind of hands that Phil's desk lacked, scarred at the knuckles, permanently collused with engine grease worked into the creases that soap couldn't quite reach. He looked at the logging road gate with the jury-rigged chain and didn't say anything, just lifted its right side the way you had to and waved her through, then resecured it behind them. He'd done this before, she noted that. At the clearing, he got out and looked around without speaking for a while. He had a notepad, but he wasn't using it yet. He was just looking at the grade of the land, at the tree cover, at the sky, at the road's surface they'd come up on. How far's the structure? He asked. 200 yards, roughly. Up through the hemlock stand. He looked at the tree line. Show me. She took him up the rise, her boots better suited to it. Now she'd bought proper ones in January. Waterproof, with ankle support, at a surplus place in Asheville where the gear was functional, and the prices were what she could afford. The ankle turning didn't happen anymore. She'd walked this rise 6 times since October and knew where the hidden rocks were, where the leaf litter was thin over ice in the cold mornings. Lyle followed slightly behind and to the left, and she could hear him thinking, not literally, but the quality of his silence had a different texture than Phil's, more active, cataloging. When they reached the foundation, he stepped inside it immediately and walked the perimeter, pressing his boot heel against the base of each foundation wall, testing for movement, crouched and looked at the mortar in the joints. He stood and looked at the chimney stack from multiple angles, then put both hands flat against the stone and pushed. Chimneys sound, he said, more than it should be after 90 years. The Fieldstone's local, she said. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. He nodded. He walked the interior of the foundation 20 by 24. She'd measured it herself twice with a tape measure she'd bought at Phil's hardware store downstairs. And she watched him doing the calculations she couldn't do, translating the ruins into the building it could become. What do you want it to be? He said. A cabin, she said. Something I can live in. He looked at her, not judgmentally, but with the specific look of someone working out whether what they're being told matches what they're seeing. Year-round, he said. Yes, insulation, heating, running water. Yes. He looked at the chimney. Wood stove. If the chimney's repointed and capped, we can work with it. Okay. He walked back to the corner of the foundation where two walls met and squatted down and looked at something close to the ground that she couldn't see from where she was standing. "This is the big problem," he said, not looking up. "I can't truck materials up that logging road without Forestry Service permission. And even if I got it, the road's not rated for load weight. We'd have to bring things in small work with what we can carry or what we can get up by ATV. What would that do to the cost? Double some of it, maybe more." He stood up and wrote something in the notepad. "And the timeline. You're looking at a long build. This isn't a 6-week job, I know. Most people hear that. And I know," she said again. He looked at her steadily. He had his uncle's eyes pale gray, measuring. "Why this place?" he said. It was the same question Gary Voss had asked from Knoxville, more or less. She'd had 2 months to refine the answer since then. "Because it was still here," she said. "Somebody built something on this ridge 90 years ago, and the chimney's still standing. I want to know if I can do something that lasts that long." Lyle Garrett wrote something else in his notepad. She couldn't see what it was. "I'll put together a preliminary estimate," he said. "It'll take me 2 weeks." The estimate, when it came, was larger than she'd let herself hope and smaller than she'd feared, which she understood was not the same as manageable. She sat with the spreadsheet he'd emailed her. Lyle was more technologically organized than his uncle. His estimates detailed and itemized and conditional, flagged with notes about variables that could affect the cost either direction. And she did the math 4 different ways, and the math said the same thing 4 times. She needed more money than she currently had or would have from alimony alone. She was not surprised by this. She had known, on some level, that the plan she'd constructed was sufficient to get her to the land and not sufficient to get a structure built on it. She'd been carrying that gap in her, thinking like a stone in a shoe, aware of it, because not addressing it would have required her to confront something she wasn't ready to confront when she was still fighting the closer battles. Now she was here. Now she had to confront it. She thought about the marketing degree she hadn't used in 22 years. She thought about the ad firm that no longer existed, and the colleagues she'd lost track of, and the industry that had transformed itself 3 times over since she'd been in it. She thought about what she actually knew how to do. And then she thought about what Phil Garrett's office had been before she reorganized it, and what it was now, and what Phil had said when she'd walked in for her interview, with limited credentials, and a resume that didn't remotely capture her skills, and what had happened anyway. Translation, she thought. The problem was always translation. She had skills. She needed to translate them into forms that people would pay for, the same way she'd to translate 22 years of household management into resume language. The question was what skills and to whom. She started carefully building a second income. It began with a single client, the wife of one of Phil's accounting clients, a woman named Donna Reese, who ran a small pottery business from her home studio in Mars Hill, and who had mentioned to Phil, in passing, that she was drowning in order management and customer emails. Phil had mentioned this to Margaret without comment, which was as close as Phil got to a direct suggestion. Margaret called Donna Reese on a Tuesday evening. Donna talked for 11 minutes without stopping, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how badly the woman needed help. Her pottery business had grown faster than her capacity to manage it. She had a waiting list for commissions, a backlog of unanswered inquiry emails, an Etsy shop that hadn't been updated in 4 months, and a customer communication system that consisted of a spiral notebook and optimism. "I can help with that," Margaret said when Donna paused to breathe. "Can't pay much," Donna said immediately. "What can you pay?" Donna named a number. Margaret did the math. It was not enough on its own. Combined with Phil's office and the first increment of a plan she was beginning to see the shape of, it was something. "I'll take it," Margaret said. She started with Donna's email backlog on a Saturday morning. 347 unanswered messages, spanning 8 months. She worked through them systematically, categories first, then priority, then response templates that Donna could use going forward. She built Donna a simple order tracking system in a Google Sheet that required no technical knowledge to maintain. She updated the Etsy shop, rewrote the product descriptions from Donna's notes, organized the commission inquiry process into a form that filtered out the questions Donna spent the most time answering. It took her 3 full weekends. Donna called her after the first weekend and said, I went in this morning and I actually knew what I needed to do. That hasn't happened in 8 months. That felt different from Phil's. This is better. This felt like something she'd built from scratch, something that hadn't existed before her hands made it. By April, she had 3 clients. Donna, a retired veterinarian in Black Mountain named Harlan who was writing a memoir and needed help organizing 20 years of journals and photographs into a coherent chronological structure. And a small nonprofit in Weaverville that provided after-school programming and needed someone to help with grant application organization, not writing the grants, just the administrative architecture that the actual grant writers needed to function. None of it paid what a full-time professional position would have paid. All of it together, combined with Phil's office, began to build something she could actually calculate with. She updated her spreadsheet on the 1st of every month. The gap between what she had and what Lyle's estimate required was still real, but it was shrinking in a way she could measure now. She was not romantic about this. She saw it clearly a woman who organized other people's chaos for money. It was less glamorous than the version of herself she'd imagined at 25. It was also something she was genuinely good at, and something that was, slowly and unglamorously, building her a mountain. Carrie came to visit in April, driving up from Raleigh with Oliver in the back seat and a cooler full of food that she tried to hand over like it wasn't charity, which Margaret accepted like it wasn't charity, and they did not discuss the agreement behind this performance, because they didn't need to. They drove up the logging road together on the Saturday, the 3 of them. Oliver, who was 5 and had recently developed an intense interest in rocks, immediately crouched at the foundation wall and began examining the fieldstone with the focused intensity of a graduate student. Carrie stood in the ruined foundation and looked at the chimney and didn't say anything for a while. "It's bigger than I pictured," she finally said. "The foundation's 20 by 24, Margaret said. Carrie looked around. At the hemlock stand, at the ridge above them, at the piece of valley visible below. All of it. It's bigger." Margaret didn't respond to that. She knew what Carrie meant. The land had weight to it, a physical reality that photographs and descriptions couldn't carry. You had to stand in it. "The chimney sound," Margaret said. Lyle confirmed it. Lyle's the contractor, Phil's nephew.
Right.
Carrie was quiet for another moment. Oliver had found a piece of quartz and was holding it up to the gray April sky. "Mom, can I say something without you getting defensive?" "You can try. I think this is going to work." Carrie said it simply, without the careful hedging Margaret had been hearing in her daughter's voice since October. "I didn't at first. I thought you were in shock, and you'd picked something impossible to focus on so you didn't have to feel the other things. I know that's what you thought, but I've watched you for 6 months, and I think you know exactly what you're doing." She paused. "Do you know what you're doing?" 60%, Margaret said. Carrie laughed. It was genuine, surprised out of her. "That's higher than I expected you to say," she said. "I'm being generous," Margaret said. What Margaret didn't tell Carrie, because there was no useful version of telling her, was that the 40%, the part she didn't know, the gap between the plan and the execution, kept her awake more nights than the good 60 put her to sleep. Permits were moving slowly. The county had questions about the inholdings access classification and whether a rebuilt structure would require a road access agreement with the Forest Service before occupancy. Lyle had warned her this might happen. She'd filed a formal inquiry in February and received a response in March that raised 3 new questions. She'd answered those. There had been silence since. She'd called the county planning office 4 times, spoken to 2 different people, been told the case was under review, which was not nothing, but was also not something. In the meantime, she couldn't build. Lyle was clear about that starting work. Without the permit, resolved was a way to get the work stopped and potentially fined, and she couldn't afford either. So she waited, and she worked, and she built the spreadsheet number, and she went up to the ridge on Sunday mornings when the weather allowed, and she sat inside the foundation and looked at the chimney and listened to the hemlocks. The hemlock stand had a specific sound in the wind different from the bare hardwoods, which clattered, or the dry grass in the clearing, which hissed. The hemlocks moved in long, layered waves, a sound that was close to white noise but warmer, with texture in it. She'd started to know the sound by its variations. Light wind was a murmur. High wind built it into something that you felt in your chest. Rain turned it into something she didn't have a word for. She brought a folding camp chair up in late April and started sitting in it inside the foundations on Sunday mornings with coffee and her notebook. She'd make notes not about the finances or the permits, but about what she saw, what the light did at different times, where the drainage ran when it rained, which sections of the foundation wall were most weathered. She was building a knowledge of the place that she couldn't get from documents. Earl Voss had built his chimney on the east side of the foundation. She'd wondered about that choice most mountain builders oriented the chimney to the leeward side to protect against wind-driven rain. But sitting inside the foundation on clear mornings, she began to understand it. The east side caught the morning light. The chimney's mass would absorb that heat and hold it, radiating into the room as the day cooled. Earl Voss had been thinking about cold mornings in a mountain winter, about a fire that didn't need much stoking to warm a small space, because the stones themselves had been doing part of the work since dawn. She wrote that in her notebook. She thought about Earl Voss more than was probably normal. She didn't have a picture of him, didn't know what he'd looked like, or what he'd done for work, or whether he'd had a family. County records from 1934 were spare. He'd built a cabin. He'd maintained the property. He'd died in 1971, and the property had passed to his son. That was what she had. But he'd chosen this ridge. He'd chosen this specific slope, this orientation, this chimney position. Those were choices, and choices told you something. She found what she was looking for in a box of county records that Carrie had tracked down in a storage archive at the Buncombe County Library old deed records and correspondence from the 1930s homesteading. Period. Part of a collection that hadn't been digitized. Carrie had driven up specifically to look through it, which was the kind of thing Carrie did when she had decided she was in on something, whether she'd announced that decision or not. Earl Voss had applied for the homestead parcel in 1931 during the Depression. His application listed his occupation as stonemason. He'd paid the application fee in installments. The application had a section for personal statement, 3 lines of it, written in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal in the way that people wrote when they were aware that writing mattered. Carrie had photographed it and texted her the image. Margaret read it on her phone, sitting in the fountain on a Sunday in May, with the hemlocks moving overhead and the valley below showing its first real green of spring. Earl Voss had written, "I have worked stone for 20 years. I know what lasts. I am asking for the chance to build something that will still be standing when I am not." She read it 3 times. The chimney was standing. 90 years and 2 generations of neglect, and the chimney was standing. She called Carrie. "I read it," she said, when Carrie picked up. "I know," Carrie said. "I figured you'd call." He was a stonemason.
I know.
He knew exactly what he was building.
Yeah.
Carrie's voice had something in it soft, but not sad. "Something else, Mom. I've been thinking. About the money gap." Margaret stiffened slightly. "Carrie, not alone. Listen to me. Not alone." Her daughter's voice was careful but forward. "I've been talking to David. And we have some money in a HELOC that we've been sitting on. We were going to use it to redo the kitchen. But the kitchen is fine. It's just the cabinets and the counters, and it can wait another 2 years. We want to put it toward the build." "No, Mom. No. It's not. I know it's not alone. That's not the problem." Margaret pressed her hand against the fieldstone chimney. It was cold, as always. It was always cold until the sun got high enough to reach it. "Problem is, I need to do this in a way I can account for. Every dollar of this has to be mine, do you understand? Not because of pride. Because of something else I can't explain well." Silence. "Try," Carrie said quietly. Margaret thought about it. She looked at the handwriting on her phone screen. "I know what lasts. Because in 31 years," she said slowly, "I never built one thing that was just mine. Everything was ours. Which meant everything was partly his, which meant when he signed those papers, he took everything. Every decision I made, everything I built or grew or organized, it all had his name on it too, and so he could sign it away." She stopped, started again. "I need this to be something he can't touch. Not legally, he has no claim, I know that. But in here," she pressed her free hand to her sternum, "I need to know I did this with my own hands and my own money and my own—" She stopped again. The hemlocks moved. "Yeah," Carrie said after a moment, very quietly. "Okay, I understand. I'm not saying never," Margaret said. "If I hit a wall, I can't get past—" "I know," Carrie said. "I'll be here. The permit came in June. Not completely, the county came back with a conditional approval that required a formal access agreement with the Forest Service before final occupancy permit would be issued. But the building permit itself was approved, which meant Lyle could start, which meant the planning she'd been doing for 8 months could begin to become something physical and real. She called Lyle from the parking lot of Phil's office at 10:47 on a Tuesday morning. Permit came through, she said. Conditional? Yes. Forest Service access agreement for final occupancy. Building permit is clear. She could hear him think for a moment. I can start ground prep in 3 weeks. I need to line up the ATV rental for materials and coordinate the first supply haul. I know. I've been pricing it. Of course you have. She could hear a smile in his voice without him making a production of it. One thing you should know before we start. Ground prep up there is going to be harder than the estimate accounted for. The slope grade and the root mass from the hemlocks I went back up last week took another look. How much harder? He gave her a number. It was not a small adjustment. She sat with it for 3 seconds. Okay, she said. Just okay. I'll adjust the spreadsheet tonight. We'll figure it out. Lyle was quiet for a moment. My uncle says you don't flinch, he said. I flinch, Margaret said. I just do it on the inside. She heard him laugh for the first time. Brief, real. 3 weeks, he said. I'll send you a materials list by end of week. She hung up and sat in the parking lot with the phone in her lap. Permit. The conditional yes that was as close to an actual yes as she'd gotten in months. 3 weeks before the ground prep started. Before the thing she'd been planning since October in a motel room with $38 and a photo of a chimney became something that made noise and moved dirt and required boots and drove lumber up logging roads on an ATV. She took a breath. Then she went back inside and finished the Q3 statements that the client needed by Thursday. Phil looked up when she came in. You got it, he said. She hadn't told him she was waiting for the call. She hadn't told anyone in the office about the timeline. Conditional, she said. But yes. He looked at her for a moment. Go home early, he said. The Marchetti file is not going anywhere. He took his reading glasses off and held them. Go home, Margaret. She looked at the geological formation of his desk. She looked at the window, at the ridge line visible above the rooftops of Ivy Ridge. Okay, she said. She drove north out of town on the road that ran along the creek, windows down, even though it was June and the heat hadn't arrived yet in the mountains, the air still carrying the leftover cool of the altitude. She drove without music, without the phone, just the sound of the road and the creek, and the hemlocks when she passed the patch of them that lined the road before it turned east toward Weaverville. She didn't go to the site. It was too late in the day for the climb, and she'd been up twice already this week. But she pulled off on the shoulder where you could see the ridge, where the hemlocks stand was just visible as a dark mass against the evening sky, and she sat there for a few minutes. Somewhere up in that dark green 90 years of fieldstone was holding its position. 3 weeks, she thought. 3 weeks. The ground prep started on a Tuesday in early July, which was not the 3 weeks. Lyle had said but 4.5, because the ATTV rental company in Weaverville had a scheduling conflict, and then there was a problem with the first materials delivery getting the right grade of structural lumber, and Lyle had refused to substitute, which Margaret had initially wanted to push back on until he explained why the grade mattered on a slope build with the moisture exposure this site would get. And then she understood, and she stopped pushing. She was learning to stop pushing on the things she didn't understand yet. That was harder than it sounded. The first morning of ground prep, she drove up the logging road at 6:45 and parked in the clearing and climbed to the site before Lyle and his helper arrived. She wanted to be there first. She couldn't have explained why that mattered to her, but it did. She stood inside the foundation in the early July light, which came in low and gold through the hemlock gaps at that hour, and she looked at the chimney and the walls and the ground she was about to change permanently, and she said nothing, just stood there. Lyle arrived at 7:15 with a man named Curtis who was maybe 25 and spoke about 4 words in the first hour and turned out to be the most efficient physical worker Margaret had ever watched. Curtis did not narrate his work or explain his process. He simply did it, continuously, without visible effort, in a way that made Margaret feel she had been previously mistaken about what human labor looked like at its best. Curtis doesn't talk much, Lyle said when they were doing a site walk together, and Curtis had disappeared into the hemlock stand to begin clearing the root mass near the foundation's north wall. I noticed, Margaret said. His work does, Lyle said. They walked the foundation perimeter together, and Lyle pointed out what he'd mapped in his planning, the drainage line they'd need to establish first, running diagonally across the slope to redirect water away from the foundation's east side during heavy rain. The root mass that had to come out along the north wall before he could assess whether the foundation's stone there needed reinforcement. The chimney he'd had a mason friend come up 2 weeks prior for a formal assessment, which Margaret had paid for separately, and the news had been better than expected. The stack needed repointing in the upper third. 2 stones near the crown needed to be replaced. The firebox interior was intact. Your stonemason knew what he was doing, Lyle said, looking up at it. He did, Margaret said. She went to work Phil's office at 9. She could not afford to stand on the ridge all day, watching, no matter how much she wanted to. The work would happen whether she watched it or not, and Phil had a client coming in at 10 whose quarterly books were a particular kind of chaos that required Margaret's full attention to untangle. She drove back down the logging road in the Honda with the windows down and the smell of turned earth and hemlock still on her jacket. Phil didn't ask how it had gone. He had the coffee made and the Hendricks file on her desk. The Hendricks wife called, he said. She wants to know if he can come in Thursday instead of Friday. I'll call her back, Margaret said. She sat down, opened the file, and began. That was how the summer worked. Weekday mornings, Phil's office, the client work, the organizing of other people's disorder. Evening hours and full Saturdays, her 3 other clients, whose needs had grown rather than shrunk over the months. Donna Reese had referred her to 2 other small business owners in the Mars Hill area, and while Margaret had taken on only one of them, a woman who made artisanal candles and had the same operational chaos as Donna patterned, Margaret was beginning to notice. After the personality type of people who were exceptionally creative and exceptionally disorganized, the referral itself told her something. She was building a reputation in a place where she hadn't had one 8 months ago. Sundays, she went up to the site, every Sunday, without exception, whether or not. Sometimes she stayed an hour. Sometimes she stayed until the light started going, and she had to pick her way back down the rise in the dimness. The build was slow. Lyle had warned her it would be slow, and she had intellectually accepted that, but experiencing it was different from accepting it. Ground prep took 3 weeks. Back-end reinforcement filling the deteriorated mortar joints in the base courses, resetting 2 stones on the north wall that had shifted, establishing proper drainage took 2 more. She was in early September, before the floor framing began. She learned to read the build the way she'd learned to read the land, by showing up consistently and paying attention to what had changed since her last visit. She took photographs every Sunday from the same position inside the foundation, a visual record she kept in a folder on her phone. Progress that was invisible day to day became clear when she scrolled back through the images, the drainage channel appearing, the foundation walls rising, or rather, being restored to what they'd always wanted to be, the first floor joists laid, dark against the pale stone. Lyle called her on a Friday evening in late August. She was at the motel she'd moved out of the weekly rate and into a longer monthly arrangement with the motel owner, a woman named Ruth, who had stopped asking how long Margaret planned to stay and had started leaving a small bag of tomatoes from her garden outside room 7 on Saturday mornings, which was the closest thing to friendship Margaret had encountered in Weaverville, and which she accepted with the same careful grace she'd applied to Carrie's cooler full of food. We hit something, Lyle said. She put down the notebook she'd been working in. What kind of something? Bedrock. Closer to the surface than the survey indicated it on the southeast corner. It's going to affect the floor plan. How much? 6 inches of differential between the southeast and northwest corners. I can work with it, but it changes how we frame the interior. Structural? No. It's cosmetic in terms of the plan. But if you want a level interior floor, which you do, for livability we have to compensate. What does that cost? He gave her the number. It was not catastrophic. It was also not nothing. She looked at her spreadsheet on the laptop, open on the desk. Okay, she said, do it. A brief pause. You don't want to think about it? I've been thinking about this build for 8 months, she said. I trust your judgment on the how. I need the floor level. All right, he said. One more thing. She waited. I've been thinking about the wall framing, he said. You said you wanted to keep as much of the original fieldstone visible as possible. Interior and exterior. Yes. The original cabin based on the foundation evidence and the chimney construction, I think Voss used a hybrid wall system. Stonist exterior, timber interior structure, with the stone doing part of the structural work. I want to do the same thing. It'll take longer and it'll cost more than straight stud framing, but the wall mass will give you thermal performance that you'd otherwise need a lot more insulation to achieve. In a mountain winter at this elevation, that matters. She thought about Earl Voss sitting with his coffee on cold mornings, the chimney stones already warm from the dawn light. Yes, she said, do it that way. It's your money, he said. It's my mountain, she said. Another brief pause. Yeah, he said. It is. The problem arrived in September, and it arrived in the form of a letter. Not from the county, not from the Forest Service, from Daniel, or rather, from Daniel's attorney, a woman named Victoria Marsh, who had been efficient and precise and relentless throughout the divorce proceedings, and who Margaret had tried very hard not to hate personally while finding her professionally formidable. The letter was addressed to Margaret's motel room, which meant Daniel knew she was still in Weverville, which meant he or someone he knew had looked. The letter stated that Daniel Holloway was contesting the terms of the alimony agreement on the basis of what his attorney described as changed financial circumstances, and was requesting a modification hearing before a family court judge in Asheville. Margaret sat on the edge of the motel bed and read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she called Carrie. Changed financial circumstances, Carrie said, in a voice that had gone very flat very quickly. What circumstances? The letter doesn't specify, Margaret said. That comes out in the hearing. When's the hearing? They've requested one. It's not scheduled yet. I'd have to respond. You need an attorney. I know. Mom, you cannot walk into a modification hearing without representation. I know, Carrie. Margaret looked at the letter in her hand. The letterhead was expensive looking. I'm going to call someone tomorrow. Call someone tonight. It's 8:30. People have cell phones. Call Harlan's daughter. You said she practiced family law. Harlan, the retired veterinarian in Black Mountain, whose journals Paula had a daughter named Paula who was a family attorney in Asheville. Margaret had met her twice when Paula stopped by to check on her father. They'd spoken briefly. Paula had seemed sharp and efficient and had asked Margaret 3 questions about the organizing system Margaret was building for Harlan's journals that suggested she understood the work Margaret was doing. Margaret called Paula Reinhold at 8:43 p.m. Paula picked up. She was apparently also the kind of person who answered unknown numbers. Ms. Holloway, she said after Margaret had explained. Tell me the original alimony terms, Margaret told her. Amount, duration, conditions. Paula was quiet for a moment. And his argument is changed financial circumstances. Has he lost income? I don't know. Has he changed employment? I don't know. We don't communicate. Okay. A pause. I'm going to be direct with you. A modification request on an 11-month agreement this early is unusual. It suggests either a genuine financial change on his part or, and this is more common, a calculated move to reduce his obligation before the most expensive months of your agreement are paid out. Cold of that landed somewhere in Margaret's chest. Can he do that? She said. He can request it. Whether it succeeds depends entirely on what he can demonstrate and what you can counter. Paula paused again. I need to ask you something. The alimony, is it your primary income right now? No, Margaret said. I have employment. Multiple clients. I'm building something. Good. Paula's voice shifted slightly, a small adjustment, but Margaret heard it. That matters. Can you come in Thursday morning? Yes. 9 o'clock. And bring everything original settlement documents, your current income documentation, anything relevant. Margaret said she would. She hung up and sat with the letter. She had known somewhere in the back of her mind that Daniel was not finished. Not because he was vindictive, she didn't think he was that. Or not only that, but because Daniel had spent 31 years operating as the person who controlled the financial architecture of their lives, and control, once habitual, did not simply stop. The signing of the papers was legal. The psychological reality was slower. She called Ben that night. Her son in Portland, who called every 2 weeks with the careful regularity of a person who loves someone and is uncertain what they need. He's contesting the alimony, she said. Ben was quiet for 3 seconds. On what basis? Changed circumstances. I don't know the details yet. Do you have an attorney? I'm meeting one Thursday. Do you need— No, she said before he finished. I'm okay, Mom. If it's money, Ben. She stopped herself. She knew the offer came from love. She knew her refusal was not straightforward pride, but something more complicated, the same thing she'd tried to explain to Carrie in May. I'm going to handle it. I just wanted you to know. A pause. Okay, he said. Then, more quietly, is he doing this because of the land? Did he find out? She hadn't thought of that. She sat with it for a moment. I don't know, she said honestly. It's possible. Someone in Asheville could have mentioned it to someone who knows him. So he finds out you're building something, and he tries to cut off your income. She hadn't said that. She wasn't ready to say that. I don't know that's what it is, she said. Ben's silence said he had a different view of that probability. Call me after Thursday, he said. Paula Reinholdt's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Asheville that Margaret had walked past 100 times without ever going into. The office itself was spare and organized, that Margaret recognized not the aggressive minimalism of someone who had no work, but the functional clarity of someone who had a great deal of it and needed to be able to find things. Paula was 41, which Margaret had known from Harlan's description, and had the posture of someone who spent a lot of time in courtrooms and knew it. She shook Margaret's hand without a preamble and sat down and opened the file folder she'd already prepared. I pulled the settlement records last night, Paula said, and I want to tell you something before we go further. Margaret waited. Your original attorney did a mediocre job on the durability clauses, Paula said. Most DTSOs, there are loopholes in modification language that leave the agreement more vulnerable than it should be. I want you to know that going in, not to frighten you, but because I don't like surprises in hearings and I don't like my clients to have them either. How vulnerable, Margaret said. Dependent on what his circumstances actually are. If he's experienced a genuine income reduction of sufficient magnitude, a judge could modify downward. She paused. But your income situation now is different from what it was at settlement. You're employed. Multiple sources. That's relevant. But I'm not earning what the alimony represents. No, you're not. Paula looked at her directly. Tell me about the land. Margaret told her. All of it, the parcel, the purchase, the back taxes, the build in progress. Paula listened without interrupting, which was itself a skill Margaret had come to appreciate in people. Do you have documentation of all expenditures related to the property? Paula said when Margaret finished. Yes. Detailed. And your current income, all sources documented? Spreadsheets, monthly. I can give you everything. Paula nodded. This helps. The land acquisition and build expenditures demonstrate that you're not sitting on the alimony, you're using it to build income-generating or self-sustaining infrastructure. That's a reasonable use of a transitional support payment, and it undercuts any narrative that you've become comfortably settled. I'm living in a motel room, Margaret said. I know, Paula said, and something in her voice acknowledged the full weight of that without making it pitiful. That helps, too. She looked at her notes. Here's what I think is happening. Someone told Daniel you bought land. He had someone look into the property transaction. It's public record, and he saw that you're building on it. He's constructed a narrative in which you're a savvier financial operator than you presented at settlement, and he's using that to argue your needs have changed. She paused. He's not entirely wrong that your situation has changed. He's entirely wrong about the implication. Can you stop the modification? I can make a strong case against it. Whether we stop it completely depends on what he presents. Paula closed the folder. I want to file a response that establishes your income, your legitimate expenses, your housing situation, and the forward-looking purpose of the land investment. I want to reframe this before it gets to a hearing if possible. What are my chances? Paula looked at her steadily. Better than 50%. I won't tell you more than that because I'd be making it up. Margaret appreciated that. She said so. One more thing, Paula said, as Margaret was gathering her documents back into her folder. The access agreement with the Forest Service for the final occupancy permit. Margaret looked up. How do you know about that? You mentioned it. And I know someone at the Regional Forest Service office. I'm not promising anything, but there are administrative paths to expediting those agreements when there's documented residential intent. If you want me to make an inquiry, I can. Margaret looked at her for a moment. You're offering to help with something that's not your area of practice, Margaret said. My father is very fond of you, Paula said simply. He says you gave him back 20 years of his life by making his journals findable. And I've watched you spend 6 months building something real out of nothing. She paused. I'm offering to make a phone call. Yes, Margaret said. Please. She walked out of the building at 11:15 onto a downtown Asheville sidewalk in the September heat and stood for a moment with her file folder under her arm and the sun on her face. Daniel was trying to take something from her again. She held that fact plainly, without the catastrophizing she'd have been capable of in October, without the collapse she'd feared in the motel parking lot in Weaverville 8 months ago. He was trying, and she had Paula Reinhold, and she had documentation, and she had a job and 3 clients and a mountain, and a contractor named Lyle, whose uncle trusted him, and a stonemason's chimney that had stood for 90 years. She walked to the parking garage, got in the Honda, and drove north. The hearing was scheduled for November. Paula filed the response in late September, a document that was, in Margaret's reading of it, precise and devastating, not in a theatrical way, but in the specific way of someone who has assembled facts into an argument that has no gaps in it. It laid out Margaret's income, her housing costs, her property expenditures, her forward-looking financial situation, and it did so in language that was so clear and so specific that the picture it drew was not of a woman who had become financially comfortable, but of a woman who had taken a settlement that was barely adequate and built it, by force of will and organization and unglamorous daily work, into something that was beginning to be sufficient. Daniel's attorney filed a counter-response. Margaret didn't read it. Paula told her the salient points. Daniel had taken a voluntary reduction in his compensation arrangement at his firm, not a loss of employment, not an involuntary change, but a restructuring that reduced his taxable income and, consequently, his alimony obligation under the original calculation formula. He restructured his compensation, Margaret said on the phone when Paula told her, yes, to reduce his taxable income. That appears to be the effect. And then he filed for modification based on the reduced income. Yes, the clarity of it, the cold, engineered quality of it took a moment to settle. That she started. Yes, Paula said. It is, and a judge may see it that way too, or may not. It depends on how cleanly his attorneys have structured it. What do? We go to the hearing, we make the case. We present your situation clearly and let the judge decide. A pause. I've also heard back from the Forest Service contact. The access agreement inquiry is moving. I can't promise a timeline, but it's moving. 2 things at once then. The hearing in November, the Forest Service agreement moving in the background, and the build continuing up on the ridge, Lyle and Curtis working Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays now as the exterior walls took shape, the timber frame rising inside the fieldstone, the structure that had been a ruin for 3 decades beginning to become something else. She went up on a Sunday in October a 1 year, almost to the day, since the settlement and since inside what was no longer a foundation but was beginning to be a room. The exterior walls were framed, the stonework reintegrated, the windows rough opened at the positions she and Lyle had planned together over 3 months of drawings on graph paper at the motel room desk. The roof framing was still open to the sky, scheduled for the following week. The chimney stood at the east end, repointed in its upper third now, the 2 replacement crown stones indistinguishable from the originals, because Lyle's mason friend had sourced them from the same ridge formation, which had taken him 3 weekends of looking, and which Margaret had paid him for, and which had been entirely worth it. She stood in the center of what would be the main room and looked up through the open roof at the October sky, which was doing the same gray pressing on gray thing it had done exactly 1 year ago. She'd been a woman in a lawyer's office a year ago today. A woman watching a pen sign her out of 31 years. A woman with $43 and a borrowed car and dress boots not suited to mountain terrain. She looked up at the sky through the open roof. She looked at Earl Voss's chimney. She thought about what he'd written. I know what lasts. She didn't know yet if what she was building would last 90 years. She didn't know if she was the kind of builder Earl Voss had been. Didn't know if her instincts about the drainage and the wall, orientation, and the chimney's relationship to the morning light were right way his had been right. But she was here. on her land, inside her walls, under her sky. Her phone buzzed. Phil. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. The hearing, Phil said, without preamble. November 14th. Paula Reinhold called the office because she couldn't reach you. I'm on the ridge, Margaret said. I know you are. A pause. She says you need to come in this week. Prep. I'll call her tonight. Phil will quiet for a moment. The quality of silences had become familiar to her over the past 11 months. She could read them the way she read the hemlocks. This one had weight in it. You're going to be fine, he said, which was for Phil Garrett, a speech. I know, she said. She stood in the open room for another 10 minutes after she hung up. Most of its windows were dark. The wind was picking up off the ridge, coming through the rough window openings, moving through the space that had been a ruin, and was becoming something else. The hemlocks moved in their long, layered waves outside the walls. Some moved fast over rock, the same water that had been moving there when Earl Voss poured his first mortar into the first course of his chimney. Pulled her coat tighter. November 14th. Paula needed prep sessions. Forest Service agreement was moving. The roof framing next week, then sheathing, then insulation, then the interior work that would take them into winter. She had things to do. She went back down through the hemlocks, her boots finding the familiar path without her having to look for it, her body knowing this ground now in a way it hadn't a year ago. At the clearing, she stopped and turned and looked back up through the tree line at the structure visible now in a way it hadn't been before the walls rose, a presence on the ridge where before there had only been ruins and chimney. A year ago, she had stood in a parking lot with $38. She turned and walked to the car and drove down the logging road, and through the gate, resecuring the chain by muscle memory, and then she pulled onto the paved road and drove south toward Ivy Ridge. She had a hearing to prepare for. She had a roof to put on before winter. She had work to do. Paula Reinhold had told her to wear something that said competent without saying desperate, which was advice that contained more practical wisdom than most things Margaret had heard in the past year. She stood in the motel room on the morning of November 14th and looked at the clothes she'd laid out on the bed, the charcoal blazer she'd bought at a consignment shop in Asheville in September, the dark trousers, cream blouse that was simple and well-made and had cost her $12 at the same shop, and she thought about what she was walking into. The Buncombe County Family Court building was on College Street. She'd driven past it 100 times. She had never been inside it for anything except the original settlement hearing in October of the previous year, which had lasted 40 minutes and ended with Daniel's pen and 31 years redistributed into columns. She was not going to think about that this morning. Put on the blazer. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, not the searching, slightly lost look she'd given her reflection in October. Standing in front of a hardware store with her coat buttoned wrong, this was something else. She looked tired, which was accurate, because she'd been up until midnight going through documents with Paula in a 2-hour prep call, and she looked older than she had a year ago, which was also accurate. But there was something behind the tiredness that hadn't been there before. She didn't have a clean word for it. It wasn't confidence, exactly. It was more like density, like she had more material in her now than she'd had then. She drove to Asheville. She met Paula in the lobby of the courthouse at 8:30. Paula was already there, already in court mode, a different version of Paula than the one who sat behind the spare desk and asked direct questions. This Paula had a stillness to her that was not calm exactly, but was control, the kind that lives on the surface to keep things running underneath. How are you? Paula said. Ready, Margaret said. Good. Remember, your income is documented. Your expenses are documented. Your housing situation is documented. We are not hiding anything, and we are not apologizing for anything. You built something with what you were given. That is not a crime. I know. If he tries to make it one, if his attorney implies you've been concealing assets or income or misrepresenting your situation, you look at me first. Don't respond directly. Let me handle the redirection. Paula looked at her for a moment. You look like yourself, she said, which was a strange thing to say and also precisely the right thing. The courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected. She'd been picturing the formal chambers of television, the high benches and dark wood and gallery seating. This was a working family courtroom, functional, a little worn, with fluorescent lighting and a judge's bench that was elevated, but not dramatically so, and a small gallery that was mostly empty. A clerk sat to the left, a court reporter. 2 tables facing the bench. Daniel was already seated at the other table. She hadn't seen him since the settlement hearing, 13 months. He was wearing a suit she recognized, navy, the good one he'd had made in Charlotte 3 years ago for a client presentation. His hair was a little longer than she remembered. He looked well. He looked, in fact, exactly as well as someone who had restructured his compensation package specifically to reduce his financial obligations to a woman he'd been married to for 31 years would look. She sat down at her table. He did not look at her. That was the same then. Some things didn't change. The judge was a woman named Honorable Sandra Peet, who came in at 9:02 and sat down and opened her folder without ceremony. She had the particular manner of a judge who has heard a great many modification hearings and is not easily impressed by any of them. Mr. Holloway's petition for modification of the spousal support order in the matter of Holloway versus Holloway, Judge Peet said. Counsel, good morning. Mr. Holloway's attorney will present the basis for modification first. Ms. Reinhold, you'll respond. Let's keep this focused. I've read the filings. Daniel's attorney, Victoria Marsh, efficient and precise as she'd been always presented the case in 11 minutes. The compensation restructuring, the reduction in Daniel's current year income, the calculation under the original formula that produced a lower monthly obligation. She presented it cleanly, without excess language, which Margaret had to acknowledge was a skill, even as the argument made her want to put her fist through something. Then Paula stood up. What Paula did in the next 18 minutes was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was the methodical, document by document dismantling of a narrative, and it was the most purely satisfying thing Margaret had witnessed in a courtroom. Paula established first that Daniel's compensation restructuring had been voluntary and strategic, that his total economic benefit from his firm had not, in fact, decreased when equity distributions were properly accounted for, and that the reduction in taxable salary was not equivalent to a reduction in financial capacity. She presented documentation Phil Garrett had provided a professional opinion letter about this, quietly and without being asked, having apparently reviewed Daniel's publicly available business filings in his capacity as an accountant, which Phil had never mentioned to Margaret, but which Paula had mentioned to Phil, that the rhythm restructuring had occurred within 6 weeks of Daniel's attorney first becoming aware of Margaret's property acquisition. Weeks. Judge Peet's expression did not change, but her eyes moved from the documentation to Daniel's table and stayed there for a moment that had weight in it. Then Paula presented Margaret's situation. Her income document, sourced, modest but real. Her housing, the motel room, the monthly rate, the ongoing expense. Her property investment, and here Paula was careful, precise, building the picture had taken transitional support and used it to build independence rather than pendency. The back taxes paid, the build in progress, the projected outcome, a dwelling that would eliminate Margaret's housing expense within a reasonable time frame, reducing her financial needs rather than increasing them. Miss Holloway is not a woman who has become comfortable, Paula said near the end. She is a woman who has spent 13 months building the infrastructure to survive without any support at all. Petition before this court would disrupt that process for the benefit of a petitioner who has not, in fact, experienced a genuine reduction in financial capacity. Judge Peet made a note. She looked at both tables. Ms. Marsh, she said. The compensation restructuring. 6 weeks following awareness of the respondent's property acquisition. Your client's current equity distributions from his firm, are they accounted for in the modification calculation? Victoria Marsh's pause was brief. The formula applies to documented salary income, Your Honor. I'm aware of what the formula applies to, Judge Peet said. I'm asking about equity distributions. Another pause. Shorter this time, but noticeable. We'd need additional time to compile. That's what I thought, Judge Peet said. She looked at her folder, then looked up. I'm denying the modification petition. The restructuring as presented does not constitute a genuine change in financial circumstances sufficient to warrant modification of the existing order. The original support payments will continue through the agreed term without adjustment. She looked at both tables. I'll also note for the record that voluntary income restructuring undertaken in temporal proximity to a support obligation does not sit well with this court. Counsel, I trust that's clear. Yes, Your Honor, Paula said. Victoria Marsh said nothing. Margaret kept her face still. She'd been watching Paula's face for cues about how to respond, and Paula's face was giving nothing, which was the cue. Judge Pete closed her folder. We're adjourned. It was 9:51. The whole thing had taken less than an hour. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Paula put her files back in her bag with the efficient movements of someone moving to the next thing. Margaret stood next to her and watched the courtroom door and waited for the feeling she'd expected, the relief, the vindication, the satisfaction of having won something. It came, but it was quieter than she'd anticipated. Not a wave, more like a slow, tired exhale. That was the equity distribution question, Margaret said. Yes, Paula said. That was the weak point in his filing, and Judge Pete found it immediately, which I expected. She's thorough. Will he try again? He could. I think today made the cost-benefit calculation less attractive. Paula snapped her bag closed. He'll pay your support through the original term. What happens after that is your situation to manage. 11 months from the settlement. The settlement had been October of the previous year. The support ran through September. 10 months left. 10 months, and then nothing from Daniel ever again, which was, Margaret realized, standing in the courthouse corridor, exactly what she wanted. She thanked Paula. She thanked her properly, directly, the way the moment deserved. Paula looked at her for a second. Call my father tonight. He'll want to know how it went. I will, Margaret said. She did not encounter Daniel in the corridor, or in the lobby, or on the street outside. He had apparently left through a different exit, or quickly, or both. She stood on the College Street sidewalk in the November cold, with her charcoal blazer and her $12 blouse and her file folder, and she breathed the cold air and looked at the mountains visible above the roofline at the end of the block. The November blue-gray of them, the specific color that the Appalachians got, in November when the leaves were gone, and the bare ridge lines showed. She drove north. She drove all the way to the logging road. She shouldn't have. She had work waiting. Phil's office, client file she'd promised by end of day, but she drove to the logging road and through the gate and up the rough grade and parked in the clearing and climbed the hemlock rise in her court clothes and her good boots and stood inside the cabin. Because it was a cabin now. Not a foundation, not a ruin, not a plan. A cabin. The roof was on, had been on since late October, sheathed and underlayment in, the standing seam metal roofing going on in sections over the past 2 weeks, gunmetal gray that would handle the mountain snow load. The exterior walls were closed in. The fieldstone integrated with the timber, framing the way Lyle had described, the way Earl Voss had apparently done it originally. The windows were rough installed, not trimmed yet, just opening-sized holes, with temporary coverings that let in filtered light. The door opening faced south, the way she'd insisted. She stood in the main room 20 by 24, the southeast corner slightly elevated over the bedrock, the floor framing compensating so the interior read as level, and she looked at the east wall where the chimney came through, the fieldstone surface interior visible the way she'd wanted, and she looked at the temporary window coverings moving slightly in the draft, and she looked at the gray metal roof above the exposed rafter tails, and she breathed. The hearing was done. The roof was on. She was standing in a room that had not existed a year ago. She sat on a stack of lumber that Lyle had staged inside for the interior work, and she stayed there for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, just being in the space. Cold of the mountain coming through the temporary window coverings, the smell of fresh timber and stone and the underlayment, somewhere outside the hemlocks. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Ben, she answered. How'd it go? He said. She denied it, Margaret said. The modification. We won, a long exhale on Ben's end. Mom, I know. Are you okay? I'm sitting on a stack of lumber inside the cabin, she said. Pause. You went to the site. In my court clothes. She heard him laugh real, relieved, the laugh of someone who had been carrying worry and was now setting it down. What does it look like? He said. She looked around the room. She tried to describe it and found for a moment that she couldn't find words that weren't insufficient. Not because it was beautiful, in a way that exceeded description. It was a rough-in construction with temporary windows and no insulation yet, and a plywood subfloor, but because what she was looking at was not really the room. She was looking at everything it had cost to make the room exist. It looks like something real, she said finally. Ben was quiet for a moment. When can I see it? Spring, she said. Come in May. It'll be done by May. She said that with more certainty than she felt. Lyle had given her a completion estimate of late March to mid-April, contingent on weather and the interior work timeline, and Lyle was honest about contingencies, which meant his estimates were reliable, in the way that acknowledged they might be wrong. But May felt right. May was the right word to say to her son. I'll book flights tonight, Ben said. She came down from the ridge at 2 in the afternoon, changed in the motel room, and was at Phil's office by 2:45. Phil looked up when she came in. He was wearing reading glasses and had a client ledger open in front of him. Well, he said. Denied, she said. The petition. He took the glasses off, put them down, looked at her. Good, he said. That was the whole conversation. She sat down at her desk and opened the client file and worked until 5:30. On the way out, Phil said, without looking up from his own work, take tomorrow morning if you need it. She didn't take it. She was in at 8. The Forest Service access agreement came through in December. Paula's contact had been as good as her word. The administrative process that had been sitting in review since February had moved in October and moved again in November, and finalized in the first week of December a formal agreement that established Margaret's right of access via the Forestry Service Road for residential purposes, with specific weight restrictions for vehicle loads and a requirement for an annual reporting of the parcel's condition to the regional office. The reporting requirement was not onerous. It was essentially a photograph log and a brief written description, which Margaret would have kept anyway. With the access agreement in hand, Lyle filed for the final occupancy permit. The county came back in 3 weeks faster than she'd expected, slower than she'd hoped, which was the pattern that the county had maintained throughout this process with remarkable consistency, with additional questions about the water source and the waste management system. She'd planned for both, a spring-fed collection system that Lyle had located and mapped on the property, and a properly engineered septic installation that had been part of the original build plan and was already permitted separately. She sent the documentation. She waited. Christmas came. She drove to Raleigh and spent 4 days at Carrie's house, sleeping in the lavender guest room, eating meals at the family table with David and Oliver, and Carrie's warmth, and David's careful friendliness and Oliver's absolute indifference to anything that wasn't dinosaurs or the new Lego set he'd gotten on Christmas morning. She cooked twice, once the biscuits she'd been making since the children were small, from a recipe she kept in her head, and once a pot of soup that she stood at Carrie's stove and made from scratch while Oliver explained to her in detail the difference between a Brachiosaurus and a Brontosaurus. They're actually different dinosaurs, he told her very seriously. I didn't know that, she said, which was true. Most people don't, he said, with the gentle patience of a 5-year-old who has accepted that adults are behind on the important information. She drove back to Weaverville on the 27th. She stopped at the ridge on the way through. The cabin in winter was different from the cabin in any other season. The snow had come in early December, not heavy, not the deep mountain winter that could arrive in January, but enough to cover the clearing and the hemlock branches and the metal roof in a layer of white that changed the quality of the light inside the rough-finished interior. She'd had Lyle install temporary heating, a propane unit, nothing permanent, so the pipes wouldn't freeze, and the cabin held a low, steady warmth when she let herself in with the key that Lyle had handed her in November with the ceremony of someone who understood what a key represented. She sat in the camp chair that she'd moved inside in October and looked at the chimney and drank the coffee she'd brought in a thermos and watched the light come through the south-facing windows properly installed now, trimmed, the glass clear and double-paned, and thought about nothing specific, just sat in the winter quiet of a room that existed, because she'd made it exist. The wood stove was not yet installed. Lyle had the unit sourced, a cast-iron insert that would connect to Earl Voss's repointed flue, but the installation required a final inspection before it could be used. That was February, he'd said. Maybe late January if the inspector could schedule it. She looked at the cold chimney and thought about Earl Voss sitting in this room, his version of this room, the version she'd never seen and could only construct from the evidence he'd left behind, with a fire in that firebox on a winter morning. She thought about the personal statement he'd written in the careful nerdy one, the careful handwriting of a man who knew that writing mattered, and chose his word accordingly. I know what lasts. She didn't know yet if she knew what lasted. She was 59 years old now. Her birthday had come in November. Quietly, Carrie calling in the morning and Ben calling in the evening, and Phil putting a bakery muffin on her desk without comment. And she had spent the first 58 years of her life building things that had other people's names on them. Most of its windows were dark, and she was still new enough at building things in her own name that she couldn't be certain she was doing it right. But the chimney was standing. Her chimney now. Her roof above it. Her key in her pocket. The occupancy permit came through on January 19th, which was the same date she had signed the purchase agreement with Gary Voss exactly 1 year prior. She didn't notice the symmetry until Carrie pointed it out on the phone that evening. That's a coincidence, Carrie said. Or it's the county's filing schedule, Margaret said. Don't ruin it. I'm not ruining it. I'm just… Mom, you have a legal, permitted, occupable cabin on a mountain. Let the date be a coincidence. She let the date be a coincidence. Lyle finished the interior in the last 2 weeks of January, and the first week of February the insulation, the drywall, the finish work on the floors, the trim on the windows and door frames. She came up every evening of those 3 weeks after Phil's office, driving the logging road in the dark, with her headlights, cutting fine hemlock, letting herself in with her key, walking the rooms with a flashlight while Lyle's crew finished around her. She was underfoot in a way that Lyle bore with patience that she tried to repay by staying out of the way, except for the decisions he brought to her, which he did promptly and without editorializing. The wood stove installation passed inspection on February 11th. Lyle built the first fire himself as a test, with Margaret standing in the main room watching. The flue drew immediately, cleanly, the smoke pulling up through 90 years of Earl Voss's fieldstone, without hesitation. She moved in on March 1st. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She drove the Honda up the logging road with a load of what she owned, which was not much, which was both a limitation and a kind of freedom she was still adjusting to, and carried it in through the south-facing door in 3 trips and put it where it belonged. The camp chair went in the main room near the wood stove thought. The fold desk from the motel room went against the north wall under the window that looked up the hemlock's slope. The books went in the stack she'd build a shelf for eventually. The kitchen, a small unit Lyle had fitted against the west wall, compact and functional and entirely sufficient, got the few things she cooked with regularly. She made coffee in the new kitchen on a mountain in western North Carolina on March 1st, and she stood in the main room with the mug and looked at Earl Voss's chimney and the cast-iron stove at its base, and the winter light coming through the south windows and the hemlock slope visible through the north window. And she thought, here was the word. Not a grand word. Not the word of arrival after an epic journey. Not the word of someone who had conquered something. Just the plain, located word of someone who had found the place they were supposed to be and was now standing in it. She called Phil first. I moved in this morning, she said. Phil said. Thank you, she said. For Lyle. For the job. For the opinion letter. A pause. You did the work. I know. I'm still thanking you. Another pause shorter. Come in Monday, he said. I have a new client, photographer. Her records are… He paused, apparently looking at something. They're an event. I'll be there, she said. She called Carrie. She called Ben. She called Donna Reese, which was not a call she'd expected to make, but which felt right. Donna had been one of the first people who had paid her for what she knew how to do, and that mattered in a way that went beyond the money. You're in it, Donna said. As of this morning. Margaret. Donna's voice had something Warmin's in it, which was characteristic. That's amazing. I want to see it. Come in May, Margaret said. Ben's coming. We'll have people. She had not had people in a place of her own, and she thought about it never, actually. The houses she'd lived in as an adult had always been Daniel's houses too, chosen together or mostly by him, furnished and arranged in ways that had been collaborative on the surface and weighted toward his preferences underneath, in the way that things had been weighted throughout their marriage, in ways she hadn't examined closely while they were happening. This cabin was 480 square feet. It had 2 windows on the south wall, one on the north, one on the east beside the chimney. The floor was Douglas fir, slightly imperfect because Lyle had sourced it from a local mill, and local mill flooring was not the consistency of commercial product, which was exactly what she'd wanted. The walls were drywall in the main room, and in the small sleeping alcove she'd framed behind the chimney, and the chimney itself was exposed stone on the interior face, the fieldstone in its mortar reading like a geological record of the ridge. She had chosen every detail, not with unlimited budget and unlimited options with constraint, with the choices available to someone working with what they had. She had chosen the window placement for the light. She had chosen the floor for its irregularity. She had insisted on the stone interior face when a simpler finish would have been cheaper because this was Earl Voss's chimney and she wanted to live with it the way he had built it. Constraints had made the choices feel like hers in a way that choices without constraints never quite did. She understood that now. She had never understood it before because she had never had to build something out of limits. In April, Harlan came up. He drove himself, which his daughter Paula had apparently tried to talk him out of, and which she had done anyway. Arriving at the logging road gate and calling Margaret from his car because he'd forgotten what she'd said about lifting the right side. She went down and let him through. He walked the rise slowly. He was 73, and his knees were what they were, and she walked beside him without hurrying, and he didn't speak on the way up. He looked at things, but he didn't speak. Inside the cabin, he stood in the main room for a long moment with his hands in his coat pockets. Smaller than I pictured, he said. Everyone says that, she said. Then they look around and they stop saying it. He looked around. He looked at the south windows and the light coming through them. He looked at the chimney and the wood stove and the exposed stone. He looked at the north window and the hemlock slope beyond it. Earl Voss's chimney, he said. She told him about it over months of organizing his journals. He'd asked good questions, the kind a person asks when they're actually interested. His repointing in the upper third, she said. 2 replacement stones near the crown. Everything else is original. Harlan walked to the chimney and put his hand flat against the stone the way Lyle had done in March of the previous year, testing for solidity. He left his hand there for a moment. Good man, he said. Not to Margaret, to the chimney, to Earl Voss. She didn't say anything. That felt like the right response. He stayed for 2 hours. She made lunch a simple thing. Soup and bread, the kind of meal the kitchen was perfectly suited for, and they ate at the small table she'd built in the corner from lumber scraps with Lyle's guidance and her own hands, which was the piece of furniture she was most irrationally proud of, because it was uneven in one leg and the surface was rough, and it was entirely hers. They talked about his memoirs, which were coming along. They talked about Paula's work. They talked about the way the light would change in this room in different seasons, a conversation that Harlan initiated and that went on longer than she'd expected, because it turned out Harlan had thoughts about light. North window's wrong, he said near the end, not unkindly, just observationally. She looked at the north window. I know, she said, I debated it, but I wanted to see the hemlocks. He nodded. He understood the logic. He didn't argue with it. When he left, he shook her hand at the south door. Paula wants to know if you'd consider taking on a small nonprofit client she knows, he said. Arts organization in Asheville. Needs what you do. Tell her to have them call me, Margaret said. He walked back down the rise carefully. She watched him until the hemlock stand closed around him, and then she went inside and washed the lunch dishes and sat in the camp chair by the wood stove and looked at the fire through the stove's glass and let the afternoon be what it was. May came. Ben flew into Asheville on a Thursday, and Carrie drove up from Raleigh on Friday morning with David and Oliver, who arrived with a backpack that contained, as far as Margaret could determine, entirely dinosaur-related materials and nothing else. They came up the rise together, all of them, Oliver running ahead and then waiting for the adults in the way that 5-year-olds do, moving fast and stopping and moving fast again. When Oliver ran through the south door and into the main room, he stopped. He looked at everything. He looked at the chimney. Grandma, he said, did you make this? I helped, she said. He looked at the chimney again, with the focused consideration he brought to rocks. The rocks are old, he said. 90 years, she said. He thought about that. She watched him doing the math, or the version of it that a 5-year-old could do, which was less about numbers than about the concept of a very, very long time. Longer than you, he said. Much longer than me, she said. He nodded. He accepted this the way he accepted most things as information, interesting, and then incorporated. Ben stood in the main room and did what everyone did, which was look at things without speaking for a while, He was 42 and looked like his father in the jaw and like Margaret in everything else, and she was used to that, had been looking at that particular combination for 4 decades, but it still caught her sometimes. You built this, he said. Not a question. With Lyle, she said. With Phil and Paula and Carrie's research and your grandfather's. She stopped. She'd been about to say your grandfather's stubbornness, which was a family joke about her father that Ben would understand. She started again. With stubbornness, she said. Mostly stubbornness. Ben looked at the chimney. He reached out and put his hand on the stone, the way Harlan had done, the way Lyle had done, the way Margaret herself had done 100 times. It's warm, he said, surprised. Morning light, she said. East face. The stones hold it. He looked at her then, and she recognized the look. It was the look he'd had at age 12, when she'd explained something about how the world worked that he hadn't known before, and that he was filing away. He'd been a quiet learner, Ben. He paid attention to things. Are you happy here? He said. She thought about the honest answer to that. Not the reassuring answer, the one she'd have given reflexively 6 months ago. She'd trained by years of managing other people's worry to produce reassurance on request. Yes, she said. Not in a simple way, but yes. He nodded. He dropped his hand from the chimney. Good, he said. Carrie had brought food, as she always did, and they ate outside that afternoon on the flat area beside the south door that Margaret had cleared and leveled in April, and where she intended eventually to build a small deck, but for now had 2 folding chairs and a camp table, and, today, a folding table borrowed from the motel that Carrie had insisted on bringing in the back of their SUV. Oliver found the quartz deposit along the foundation's north wall and spent 45 minutes in focused excavation while the adults ate and talked, and the May light moved across the hemlock slope. David, who had never said much about the cabin project in 18 months, supportive in the background, consistently, without involving himself in the drama, sat next to Margaret and said quietly, while Carrie and Ben were in a conversation about something else, I want you to know I've been watching what you did here. She looked at him. I thought it was too much, he said, when Carrie first told me. I thought you were in shock and you'd picked something impossible. I didn't say that to Carrie because it wasn't my place, but I thought it. I know, Margaret said. Most people did. I was wrong, he said simply. She looked at Oliver, still excavating the quartz deposit. He's going to be good at things, she said. He's going to be stubborn at things, David said. Same outcome, she said. They stayed until 6, when the May Mountain evening started to cool faster than the sun would compensate for, and Oliver had to be convinced that the quartz would still be there next time. He extracted a promise to that effect from Margaret directly, which she gave him. When they'd gone, Carrie's SUV, picking its careful way back down the logging road, Ben in the rental car behind them, Margaret sat in the chair outside the south door and watched the light leave the valley. The valley went gold, then amber, then the particular blue-gray that was her favorite, the color it got in the last 20 minutes before dark, when the ridge lines went soft and the hemlocks darkened and the sky above the mountains held its last light like it was in no hurry to let go. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known on an October morning in a lawyer's office in Asheville. She knew that $43 was not a floor. She knew that the distance between what you have and what you need is not a fixed measure, but of what you're willing to do with the space between them. She knew that the thing you build in constraints is more yours than the thing you build in abundance, not because suffering is instructive in some tidy way, but because constraint forces you to make real choices, and real choices are the only ones you can stand behind. She knew that the people who show up Phil with his nephew's number, Carrie during Oliver's nap times, Harlan's daughter making a phone call, Gary Voss saying, "Call me back in January," are not miracles. They are the ordinary result of treating people with directness and honesty and not pretending to need less help than you actually need. She knew that Earl Voss had been right. She knew what lasts. Not because she'd figured it out philosophically, but because she had watched it. Stone and honest mortar, properly laid, on a ridge in the Pisgah, 90 years. Chimney was standing. She also knew, and this was the part she hadn't expected, the part that had arrived quietly over the course of 18 months, rather than all at once, that what she'd lost was real. She didn't clean that up in her head anymore, didn't try to make a meaning out of it that erased the loss. 31 years. A person doesn't erase 31 years by building a cabin, no matter how good the cabin is. The years happened. The marriage happened. The signing of the papers happened. And then this happened. Both things were true. She'd stopped needing one to cancel the other. The valley was dark now. The ridge line still held a thin line of light above it, the sky going deep blue. From where she sat, she could see, far below, the lights of Walden Creek, a farmhouse, a barn light, the headlights of a car, moving slowly along the road that followed the creek. Small, human-sized domesticity. Ordinary life going on down in the valley while she sat on her mountain. She stood up. She was stiff from the chair, to replace with something that had actual lumbar support, which was a problem for another time. She went inside. She put another log on the wood stove. She made tea. She sat at her uneven table with a notebook, and she wrote the date and a few things she wanted to remember about the day. Not the events exactly, she'd remember those. The quality of things. The way Ben's hand had looked against the chimney stone. Oliver's serious face over the quartz. Harlan had used the word good, addressed to Earl Voss, and it had been exactly the right word. She closed the notebook. The cabin was quiet around her. Not silent, the mountain was never silent. The hemlocks moved. Something moved in the leaves near the north wall, small and nocturnal. The wood stove ticked and breathed. The wind off the ridge found the gaps in the door frame that she'd caulk in the fall when she'd had time and wasn't trying to do 17 other things simultaneously. This was her life. Not the life she'd planned at 30 or expected at 40 or understood at 50. This specific life, in this specific room, on this ridge, with this chimney and these hemlocks and this uneven table and the caulking she hadn't done yet and the deck she hadn't built yet and the arts nonprofit Paula had mentioned and the new client files waiting on Phil's desk and the spring in the ground that fed her water and the 10 months of alimony she had remaining before she was entirely on her own, which she was not afraid of. She was not afraid of it. She was 59 years old and she was not afraid. That was the whole of it right there. Not a triumphant thing. Not a resolved thing in the way of stories that tie off cleanly. Just a woman in a small cabin on a mountain in western North Carolina, not afraid of the life in front of her. Earl Voss's chimney stood on the east wall. The hemlocks moved. The stove breathed. She blew out the lamp and went to sleep.